Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar and demonstration. My name is Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And today we'll be talking about and building a demonstration and a workflow around how to integrate ServiceNow as a source of truth to drive network automation. So this is a bit of a more advanced topic. If you have been following this series, we started kind of very simple, and really it's been revolving around using ServiceNow to open, update, and close trouble tickets as part of a network automation. And we've kind of progressed through all of that. In our last webinar around this topic, we talked about how to run an automation from ServiceNow as the center of the self-service portal world for your organization, and run from ServiceNow an automation within the Itential platform. Now we're taking a slightly different approach to automating ServiceNow in this case, because this really comes from some of our customers who have come to us and said, we know you do a lot of network automations, right? You can speak to the network on one hand, and we know that you've been able to help us build automations that integrate with ServiceNow through the trouble ticketing system. But one of the things that's come up in our IT organization is we're starting to use ServiceNow as a center of the universe for not just trouble tickets and change request tickets, but for IT inventory. And this makes a lot of sense because if you're ordering something, if through ServiceNow through tickets, it's helpful to have the inventory part of that database that's under the covers of ServiceNow. And so this makes a lot of sense. But now the request for inventory is now being asked of the network team to have their own table, their own database, and populate that with their own inventory. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in this demonstration, we're going to talk a little bit about, and this is great context for networking folks, but this is also going to be great context throughout this demo for DevOps folks and for ServiceNow administrators to help understand everybody's technology, because it's going to take all of us working together to be able to do something like this. And so I want to help to understand from the networking practitioner's perspective what it means to create a new inventory in ServiceNow and columns and fields and things like that. So we'll spend a little time talking about that. Then we're going to get right into building an automation. And this automation is going to talk to some network routers, pull information in real time about the software version that it's running, its IP address, and its location. And then we're going to build a transformation. And we've talked about transformations in the past, but we're going to build a transformation to take that live network information and format it in a way that's now compatible with an API call into ServiceNow. Then we're going to use that and call ServiceNow to update the inventory with the data collected from the network that we got earlier. And then finally, that's going to populate a table, right, an inventory table for the network team in ServiceNow. And from that point on, I'll show you how to use some very simple API calls from any network automation, and to use now this table as a source of truth for inventory accessing ServiceNow. And so just to kind of deeper dive into what we'll be doing. So from a ServiceNow perspective, we're going to be populating a table called IP routers. It's an inventory table. We're also going to be searching that inventory table, IP routers, as a source of truth. We're going to be interfacing with ServiceNow through the REST API that's been onboarded and integrated into the system. And we're going to build a workflow. Ultimately, the workflow that we're going to build to populate the table is going to not just query a single device, but query a group of devices, because you're going to have a lot of devices on your network, and you want to be able to start from, testing from a singular device, and then eventually scaling that out to multiple devices once you've built the automation and you have confidence in it working. So we'll show you what that end result looks like, but we'll start with a single device. And that device is going to do a series of queries, basically CLI queries to that device, pull that information, transform that data into something ServiceNow can use, right? Because it has its own format for the API calls. We'll show you how to use some of the tools in ServiceNow to understand where that data and that information comes from. And then we'll ultimately update the ServiceNow inventory. And then after that, I'll show you how to read data back from ServiceNow in that particular inventory. So with that, let me share my screen and we can get started. Okay, so right now we're going to start off in ServiceNow. And so the first thing we want to do is we want to take a look at and get an understanding, especially from the network practitioner's perspective, what we mean by tables and inventory. So if I go into, I'm logged in as administrator, and typically this is not anything that a network practitioner would have to do. You're going to work with somebody who administrates ServiceNow to build these tables. But again, for you to understand what it looks like is good context as you work with them. So if I search for tables here, I can take a look at within ServiceNow and take a look at the tables definitions. And ServiceNow is there's a database under the hood, and it's very table driven, and it's very relational. So it's a very complex machine that we're looking behind here. But there's a layout to it. An inventory is a series of tables. This isn't just one table. So technically, you're going to be getting, if you're a network practitioner and you're being asked to populate an inventory table, you're going to have a very specific inventory table that you're going to use for particular parts of the network, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to save a little time, there's kind of a series of master inventory tables, and we're going to peek at one of them called network gear. And I'm using the ServiceNow developers instance, and I'm going to be kind of sticking to that because it may be helpful if you're going to start to use, if you're already using Itential's platform, or you're going to start to use Itential's platform, you can integrate this and start testing it with a ServiceNow developers setup. And all of this is kind of pre-populated, so you can start testing across it. And in this case, we'll take a look at this table called network gear. And this is an inventory, but it's an inventory that extends a previous table called hardware. We won't get into that, but the idea of extending is important because if you think of this table as a child of hardware, right? So there's a greater table called hardware. This extends that table, so it's kind of a child of it, with the hardware being the parent. And that's important because any of these columns or fields that are defined, that I'll show you in a minute, become inherited from tables before you, or parent tables above you. And so hardware is a table that has a set of columns or fields. When I extend that in this table called network gear, you can define another set of columns or fields that will inherit everything above it, but then define new ones. And then you can actually have another nested or another child table as well. And that's what we have down here. We have other child tables that extend to network gear. So now you can kind of see the complexity of these databases. And all we really need from a networking practitioner's perspective is, what table do we need to put our inventory into? If we wanted to create that, I could go back to this master tables view. I could click on new here in ServiceNow. I could give it a label. I could call it Rich's Routers. It's going to populate a name. It's going to give me a new name for this table. And then I can extend it. So now it becomes a child of the parent network gear. And I could save that. And we've just essentially created a new table that's inheriting all of the columns from network gear. Let's pull it up real quick. There it is. So we've just created this. Again, this is something that you would work with your ServiceNow administrator to build. But here are all the columns that are available. These were all inherited from network gear and then from any parent table before that. So these are now the columns or the fields that define every single router that's part of this inventory can have these fields filled out. And specifically, some of them must be filled out, right? For this to be an inventory source of truth that's even useful. So we can also now define a new column here. And so if I wanted to create a column called hostname, I could do that. Oh, sorry, this got to be a string. So we have to find the type first. And now I can call it hostname. Give it a length, 100 characters. And if I submit that, it's going to add it to the list of columns, which become fields in a form that we can fill out. So I can go, and it should pop up in our, oops. Let me go back here, clear this out. There it is. Here's our host name that we've just created. So now I've created a table specifically for Rich's Routers. It's going to inherit all these other columns, and I've created a new column called hostname. So that's what's really going on in the background process when you work with your ServiceNow admin to create a new table for your inventory. Honestly, I'm just going to reuse something that already exists. So I'm just going to delete this table. And we're going to use something that already exists in the developer's environment because it matches up to what we're going to do here. So as this deletes, we're actually going to go back and take a look at something called IP router, and then take a look at the columns in that. And that's another table that inherits um, from the network gear. All right, so that finished. Let's clear this. So if I get network gear again, so this is the kind of the parent table. And if I go open this up and I look down below, it's actually going to say extend. Here are the bunch a bunch of tables that extend what the network gear. We already have one that's pre-created as pre-populated called IP router. So we're gonna populate IP router with data as part of our inventory. So we can see the fields here, and if we go down, we can take a look at the list. The list view shows us what data is actually populated in this database, and it's already got three test entries here. They really don't exist, but they're useful for us to understand this view of it. So if I click on one of these devices, imagine this. So you're the network practitioner, and your team is now tasked with populating this IP router database with all of the detailed information of all of the network devices that you have. So how many is that? Hundreds, thousands of network devices? So what's going to be the process that you're going to have to do if this is all done manually? Okay. Number one, I have to have a list of all of my devices. Number two, what's the IP address? Number three, what's the authentication information I need? Then I need to SSH into one device, execute a series of CLI commands, let's say one at a time, because I have to take the output of that CLI command, parse out the information that I need, copy it, put it in a notepad, do the next command, parse out the information I need, copy it, put it in a notepad. Once I've defined all of the CLI commands, the show commands that I need to do to pull that information, then I get to take my notepad, go over to ServiceNow in a GUI much like this perhaps, and start manually filling these forms out, copying and pasting. We call that the swivel chair and copy and paste. And if you're going to do that, rinse and repeat for hundreds or thousands of times, nobody wants to do that. And not only that, even if you could farm it off to an intern, do you trust that that data is going to be legitimate, or are there going to be errors that creep up, because this is a very monotonous task? So really, if the data going into this inventory table is a source of truth, it really, really, really needs to be accurate. So this is the what's happened with some of our customers saying, hey, this is what we're tasked with. We know you can do something on the network. We know you can do something in ServiceNow. That's what your platform's really good at. Typically, it's updating tickets and making changes on the network. But can you read devices on the network, parse that data out, and then send that up to ServiceNow to update a table, an inventory table? And of course, the answer is yes. And that's exactly what we'll be doing. So we're going to be populating some of these fields in our automation today. Things like firmware version, right? Things like IP address and SNMP location. Those things we'll pull out live from the network, and then we'll fill out some of these other these other fields or columns here as well. So let's now move back over to the Itential platform, and let's get started. So I am in, let's see, we'll get to Automation Studio. Automation Studio is where we will build on a canvas, and we have a bunch of workflows already in here, but we'll start a new one. I'm going to build a workflow. We'll call it ServiceNow webinar 4 concept. I'm going to use our Gen 1 workflow, as it'll be a little easier to follow here. And we start with a blank canvas. And one of the things that's useful as we just kind of get our minds wrapped around where to start building a workflow, we have a tool here, or it's actually a task called Stub, which is just a placeholder, if you can think of it that way. And I start to try to break a workflow down into phases. So phase one, I have to execute a CLI command on a Cisco device, like a Cisco router, or multiple CLI commands, but we'll take it simple. So run, we'll do this, get iOS version, right? That's the first thing I want to get. Um, and then we'll stub in another task here. Again, so these are just placeholders. They don't really do anything. But what's the other thing I need to do? If I get information from a network device, I need to push it into ServiceNow. So just defining my phases. Okay. So if I had a workflow that did this, that would be really useful. Get some information from a network device and just push it directly into ServiceNow. However, there's an intermediate step that's overlooked, and that intermediate step is data that you get from a CLI output is not directly usable by a ServiceNow API call. So there has to be a way to transform that data, and that's an intermediate step. And we do that with transformations. So now in reality, our three phases are going to look like this. Execute a CLI command, get the iOS version, transform the data so that we get the information we absolutely need. And then we're going to have to change the output of all of this data into something ServiceNow can understand through an API call. Okay, so we can start here by executing a CLI command. Now, I'm going to show you a little tip and trick here. No extra cost for this. Let me duplicate this tab. In the past, we've talked about command templates. This is a really, really nice thing for network engineers to be able to take their CLI knowledge and build a set of rules so that you can execute CLI commands and understand if certain things like interfaces exist and pass and fail scenarios. We're going to use it more as a tool to help us tune some of our CLI commands. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'll create a new command template here. And this is going to allow us to now test execute a CLI command on a device live without leaving this environment, without opening up SSH. And this is a great little tool if you're a networking engineer. So I can define this, and this is pulling from a live inventory. So if I just do something like this, it's going to tell me everything that matches in the inventory. I'm going to start testing on this particular router, core ATL0. And here I can run a command. So if I want to get the version, I can do something like this. Show version, I can test this command, and in the window below, it's going to give me the output of a show version in the CLI. Okay, so here's the output. Everything under result pass, this is the output, but that's a ton of output. How much of that data do I actually need to send to ServiceNow just to tell it what firmware it's running? I need this. This is going to tell me all the details I need for the firmware. So if you're a network engineer and you know, because you do this instinctively, right? You know, there's a ton of information on a show command for a lot of different show commands. So you want to parse that out. So we can do a little bit of helping the automation here by parsing out only the thing we really want. So if this is unique to that output, I can test it again, and it should narrow down everything I need just to that output. And so if I test this command again, it should give me just that line instead of, I don't know, 30 or 40 lines of text. And again, this is something we do instinctively. We don't want to see everything. We want to narrow down to the right thing that we want. And this gives us this. So this is good. So I'm going to copy this because this is the command we really want to execute in this automation. So now let's replace our stub with something real. So I can execute an iOS command. And again, it's just a simple task. It's right here. And we can leverage Ansible modules to talk to all sorts of network devices. So in this case, since it's an iOS device, we're just going to call it get version. Okay, so now we have a set of information that we have to fill out in order to execute this command. So one of them is a host. This is the router. So the one I'm testing on is core ATL0. Where does that come from? Well, another part of our application is called Configuration Manager. You can pop into that really quick, and that has an inventory of all the devices that have been onboarded into the platform. And we can see core ATL0. We've got several. We're going to be working on these 4 today. So that's where that comes from. So I'm going to use core ATL0. I'm going to put it in core quotations because it's a string. However, you see this variable type is an array. So an array is expressed as bookended by brackets like this, and you can actually have um, multiple elements in an array. In this case, it's only a single element. I'm only going to run one command on one device, but I have to put it in this format in order to satisfy the, the type here. Same thing with commands. So our command that we just used the command template to test on is this, but it's also asking for an array. So I am going to bookend that with brackets here. And really, that's it. That's all I need. So now let's get rid of this stub since that was just a placeholder. And now I can create a workflow that looks like this. We'll save it. And now if we run, we can view the job. So we're just going to test to make sure that this runs okay. If I go to visualize, we can see it in action. So it's actually sitting here running. It's executing that CLI command. And because of that, it's going to give us an output. And what we want to take a look at is the output to make sure we're extracting the right information, which we should, because we tested that in a command template. But it's always good as part of the phased approach to building a workflow doing this. So while that runs and gets that information, reload this here. Okay, it's completed. If I double click, it's going to tell me the incoming outgoing variable. So if we look at the incoming variables, this is what we defined when we put that task on there. We defined this is the host you're going to connect to. This is the command you're going to execute. And now we can see the outgoing information. And here, the outgoing information is quite a bit, right? It's delivering quite a bit of information. But the thing we are most interested in is this right here. This is the output, and it's located nested in what's called a JSON object. And we'll when we work with the transformation, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're seeing that the output in this key right here called standard out is exactly what we expect. So that's awesome. We've just executed our first command in this first phase. So now we want to do two more commands. And so what I can do here is I can copy this task because we're using the same task type. We're just executing a command. And since we're going to do 3 of these, we could just copy it 3 times or 2 more times. And then we can modify this. Okay, now this command is going to be different. So this isn't get version. This is going to be get IP address. Let's say that I know that the gigabit Ethernet 1 interface exists. It's like a management interface, let's say, that exists on all of these routers. So now I want to do, and I know that as a Cisco person, I can do something like show IP interface gigabit Ethernet 1. That's going to show me, that should show me what I need, but it might give me more. That's something we can test real quick. We can go back to our command template, and instead of doing this, we can do this. Back on core ATL0, we can test this command. We can get the input, and now we can just kind of take a look at what that output does. And is there anything else that we could do from the command line to help us kind of narrow that field down to just what we're looking for? And this particular, since we're being specific to that gigabit Ethernet, it should give us just specific information. But as you can see, there's a lot of information about that interface that the router gives back. And really all we want is this internet address. So if we do something like this, that should narrow it back down to precisely what we're looking for. And while that's populating, I'm going to go ahead and populate back here. So we're going to modify our command. Now, give us more specifically what we're looking for. All right, and the third one, this is going to be, we're not going to do get version. We're going to get the location, and we're just going to assume that this is a location that's set correctly as part of the SNMP server location. Um, so where does that come from on a Cisco router? Well, you probably need to, one place you can get it is the show run. But we don't want the entire configuration. We want to just parse out the SNMP server location. So we do this all the time in the world of Cisco. We want to look for something very specific. So we do the include there. Again, we're using the same host here. So if I save that, now I have all three of my iOS commands, and I can do this. I could have put them in a line, like stringing them one after the other, but we can also run them in parallel. This saves us a little time, especially for the demo. And we can run these things in parallel just like that. So it's going to do a CLI version. And since we're doing show commands, that's safe to do. Obviously, if you're doing any kind of write commands, you don't want to do that. You want to serialize and check everything. But we can do this for the case of reads. So if I save this, we can run it. And now it's going to execute all three of those commands. We'll go to the visualize and see where it's running. It's going to execute these three commands. Now, while it's doing that, let's talk about this next piece, this transform data, because we're going to build a data transformation. Technically, we call it a JST, JSON schema transformation, to take the data coming from all three of these commands, these tasks, parse out what we want, and then turn that ultimately into something that ServiceNow can use directly. Normally, if you're going to do this in a manual process, this is something you would do, right? The swivel chair, the copy and paste, and then the GUI dashboard, inputting everything into ServiceNow. So this data transformation is going to do that transformation piece. Okay, so we've got all of our iOS commands here done. We can actually take a look. Remember that standard out is what we really are interested in each one of these commands. They all follow the same format because they're all the same type of task. They're just executing a CLI command. Again, standard out, here's our SNMP server location. So we look at this and all of our CLI commands are executing correctly. So now we're going to change our focus onto this task right here, this transform data. So in order to do that, let's see, let me duplicate this, open a new task up here, and we're going to create a transformation. Let that load up first. All right, we're going to create a transformation. Okay. Here's our transformation. A little different kind of canvas here, and this is about manipulating data, creating schemas, and manipulating data. So on the left-hand side, we have data incoming, and on the right-hand side, we have outgoing data. So remember, if we go back to here, let me close this out. If we go back to here, this transformation is going to sit right here in our workflow. So data coming in is our incoming. Data going out is we're going to pass over to ServiceNow. Okay, so let's take a look at this incoming schema, and let me bring that a little bit bigger there. Where does this data come from? So remember, we're going to take it one at a time. It's the output of every one of these commands is what we need to define here. So in order to get that output, there's a real simple way in our platform to do that. If we run this command, which we already have, here's the view of us running it earlier, just a moment ago. If I double click, I actually can look at the outgoing data from this task. That's the CLI command, and I can copy it and just copy the entire JSON object that it output. Now I can go back into my designer and I can tell it, we're going to add something new. And on the left-hand side is you can define it by hand, but on the right-hand side, we have the ability to paste in any valid existing JSON and then click this button to infer. So the software will infer or figure out what the real JSON schema needs to look like, and it preserves the information that was passed, which is very helpful for us when we do some testing. So the only thing I really need to fill out here is a unique name under the ID field, and we can call this get version. Let's call it get version. It doesn't really matter; it just needs to be unique. Okay, so now it's filled this out, and this is what now it's expecting. So if I go back here, when this outputs into here, that format is going to be the same because we just created an incoming schema that matches the outgoing schema of when this gets run. So now that should match completely. So what do we need to get out of here? So if we recall, if I double click into this and we take a look, let me go to the other view. Sorry. If we take a look at the data that we actually got, we need to access this part of the schema, right? So if you think of it as where can we find that data in this nested object, you could say, and called standard out. So I'm going to show you. So first of all, the thing we want to do is we want to query that data out. So on the right hand side, when we build these transformations, they can have as many of these methods, and they're ways to manipulate or query data. And I'm going to use something called query, and this works on a JSON object. So you can see if I put it here, I'm going to go pass on null true here, and I can pass this entire object into this query. And now I get to define a query to parse out that particular information. And so I'm going to show you what that query is going to look like for this and for the subsequent ones, and then give you a quick explanation of how we arrived at that. Okay, so we'll work it kind of backwards. You see standard out, std out. That's what we looked at when we looked at the output of when we ran that CLI command, and this is where it exists. However, notice that it has a type called an array. And remember, an array is bracketed or bookended by these brackets here. And so because there can be multiple elements in an array. In this case, we want the first element, which is 0, because machines start at 0 when they count in integers. And so we're gonna ask for element 0 of standard out. Now we move up the array. It's also a part of this object called results. So that's the next piece. So results. That's also a part of a response, which is also an array. So up here in our query string, we have response, and we have to specify what element of that array, because it could be multiple. In this case, it's just the first one. So 0. And then going up the tree, it goes to completed. And if we look at completed, that's also an array. So that's where this comes from. Now you can use tools to query JSON objects that will help you determine what this needs to look like. But it's a standardized way of doing queries with JSON objects. And in fact, you can click this button here, and it'll take you some documentation to help explain that further. But that's where this comes from. So now we're looking down completed, first element of that, response, the first element of that, results, which is an object, not an array, so we don't have to have those brackets, and then out of results, standard out, which is an array, so we want the first element of that, and that's where that comes from. So now that'll take that big old query, that big old object here, and just query out the one thing we're looking for, which is the version data from the CLI command. And now we can do something like this and map it to an outgoing schema. In this case, I'm going to define it because it's very simple. I'm going to call it version, and it's going to have a type. In this case, we're just going to use string. So this variable is a string, and now I can map this directly into here. And now we can save it and we can test it without actually having to run it in automation. So it's going to use that information from our inference to test this whole process here. So it took the big object that we used that had all that data, queried out this one thing, right? And then stuck it into a variable called the string variable called version. And this is what it's outputting. It's saying, okay, I parsed all that out, queried it, and this is what I returned. That's perfect. That's what we want. Okay. So now we can do the same thing with the other ones, and we can do the same process. So we can have multiple inputs here. Remember, we're going to get 3 inputs, one for each of the CLI commands. So I need to get the next incoming schema. And if I go back to where we ran the commands, remember the outgoing data from this becomes the incoming for the next one in our incoming schema. So we can just infer it again. So this is from the IP address. Infer, and I'm just going to call this IP address. Save it. And it's going to give us, again, another one of these. And we can do another query. And very similar, we can pull this object, bring it in here. I can actually reuse the same query string because this is the same API call. So it's going to be the first element of all those things is our output. And now we can take a look at this, and I can actually just, clone this, edit it, change the name. So instead of version, we go IP address, save it, map it over to here, save it. Now let's run this and see what it outputs. Oh, I forgot to click on this right here. All right. Now, aha. So it gave us our second variable that we defined, another string called IP address, and this is what it's set to. Well, we got a bit of a problem here. We don't need this. So we need to transform that data and basically cut that out. We want to keep this. This is useful. This is redundant. So how do we do that? Well, we use more methods. And so one of the methods that we could use is, there's several ways to do this, is we can go under string here and we can do a match. So if I do this, and this allows us to do a regular expression match. So I'm going to, instead of mapping that directly to the end variable, we're going to transform it in another step. So it's going to take this string, and I'll spare you the regular expression, kung fu, but basically this should parse out everything we need numerically in this IP address, including the dot and the slash. Now, we're going to try to output this as a string, but as you can notice here, if I try to connect it, it won't. Why? Because the types are different. We said this is a type string, but this is going to return an array. So now we have to convert this array, even though it's a single element array, back into a string. So we can go from the array methods, go to toString, and that will do the conversion for us, just like that. Let's save it. Now let's take a look at what we've got. Aha! Now we've gotten down to the essentials. So one more to go. So the last one was show SNMP location. So we need to, the helpful thing again is to go back to where we've already run it in Job Manager, get the output of that. So this defines the output of this command or this task. And then we use that as the input to infer the schema. We're going to do the same thing here. We give it a unique name, what we call get location. Okay. So here it is. We've done that. So now again, we're going to query the same thing. So we can use another query right here. Bring that back in. I'll click true on this one. And then our query string, again, it's the exact, we figured it out once. And so it's going to be the same for every one of these CLI commands and the output. Now, let's clone this. We can edit it, give it a new name. This is going to be called location. Save it. Okay, now we can map this to our location string. That's acceptable because it returns any type, and that's acceptable as a string here. And so if I save that and we run it, let's take a look at what location returns. Okay, so location returns a little bit more extraneous information. So we could use a regular expression match to parse that out. There's several ways, but I'll show you another way to do it. Since this is always going to be a static amount of characters, so how many characters that is before we actually get to the data we want, which starts here in Atlanta Midtown, I can count that down, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So 21 characters into this string is the data that we want to the end of string. So if I go back under string and we use substring, little tooltip tells us you can identify an index. Oops. You can identify an index to start, and it will go to the end of string, to the string. So I can now map this string over into substring. I can tell it to start at character 21. I don't have to fill anything out here because that means end of string. And now I can map this over to this guy. And so we can test it out again. And here we go. That has parsed out everything we did not need. And now everything looks good as far as this is the data we want to populate into our inventory table. Okay. So we're in excellent shape here. So let's go back to our workflow. We now need to replace this transformed data with something real, right? And so that's called a transformation. So let me pull in a transformation. And then we can delete that because that was the stub. That it wasn't actually doing anything. It was just helpful to us for planning this workflow out. So now I can connect everything to here. We can double click that. And now it's going to ask us for the transformation name. So now we're going to, I could have just done this, make it easier. This is the transformation we created, ServiceNow W4 concept. You'll notice it's going to populate the incoming schemas. So remember, that's what we defined, the incoming schemas here, all three of these, get version, IP address, and get location. We have to now tell it, where does that data come from? It's going to come from each one of these tasks. So that task is called get version. So I'm going to use that, and that's that standard out. IP address, that's going to be get IP address, and get location. So the input of this is the output of all of these based off of the definition that we created in the transformation. So that looks good. And now we can go over to here and tie that in. Now, here's the thing, though. We've really only worked on half of the transformation. We've got it into a readable format for humans. The only information we really need that's relevant to updating that inventory field, but really we have to work on the other side of it, which is the outgoing piece, because while it's usable and readable for us, we really need to put it into a format that makes sense to ServiceNow, and this is going to be another API call. So we need to replace this with a real API call and then modify our transformation to fit what this requires. So if we remove this, go back to this, I can go into ServiceNow and you can browse through all of the ServiceNow tasks that can be dragged into the desktop here. But really what we need to use is what's called a generic adapter call. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull that in, generic adapter request. And that's actually going to be what we're going to use here to do the real work. So now we've removed our last stub. We'll save this and we're going to take a look at the data that this requires. And we can just call this update ServiceNow. It's going to require something called a URI path, a REST method, and possibly more data in here. So where does that come from? Well, it comes from ServiceNow. This is going to have to fit. Remember, we have to transform this data into something that fits what ServiceNow wants. So in order for us to understand what ServiceNow wants, we have to go and reference ServiceNow. And so you can do that through the API documentation, but ServiceNow actually has a very helpful tool. So if I go back to ServiceNow here, I'm going to save this by duplicating it. So we'll keep that tab because we're going to look at that in a moment. But if I go to ServiceNow and I go under all here, I can filter for REST. And there's something called REST API Explorer. This is going to help us determine how to format everything for ServiceNow. So what do we want to do? Look on the left-hand side here. We want to ultimately create a new record in an inventory table. So if I click that, it immediately tells me some things I need to know. This is a post method. So that's one of the fields we're going to need to fill out. It also tells me, once I fill out which table I want to use this on, we're going to use IP routers. So if I type that there, now it's going to fill out the table that we need. And then from here, it's going to give us some other information that's useful for us to run this command. So if we think about it, in order to populate a new entry into the ServiceNow table for inventory, we have to set some fields to tell it. And what we set in those fields is going to determine the record, right? So one of those fields is probably name. It's probably like we need a field for IP address. So where do we get that information from? It's defined as columns in this table. So if I go back to this view here in ServiceNow, and if I look at an entry, I can right click on any one of these, and it's going to tell me what the field name is kind of under the hood, firmware underscore version, or this column name. So that's something we're going to have to populate. Let's see, what else do we have here? IP address, IP underscore address. That's something we're going to have to populate. Okay, so that's where we can get some hints from it. But actually, ServiceNow goes us a step further and helps us out even more. So you see this request body. This is where we have to define those fields. And if you look here, we can add these fields one at a time. And it's going to create the JSON object that's going to get passed to ServiceNow for a successful API call into this. So I can actually go name, okay, name, and I can actually say S router one, and you see it's filling out this JSON object. I can add another one. Let's say IP address. There it is. 2.3.4/24. Since the other one was SNMP location, nowhere. Okay, so now this is the JSON object that is going to get passed to it, and this gives us a hint of what we need to do in our automation. So this is where all that data comes from. Using something like the REST API Explorer in ServiceNow and other applications have this too, is very useful. So now if I send this, let's send it. It's going to give us a response back that says it was created. It's actually going to give us a response body. So this is what we should expect to see when we run this API call ourselves in an automation. But let's go back to here, and we'll go back to the, whoops, let me go back to IP routers here, the view, and we can see our test router came in. So we ran that API call from the REST API Explorer, and now we see that it actually functioned and it created the test router. So now we can take that same information that we've learned and start applying it to our API call in the automation. And so one of the things that we need to look at is the actual post, and one of them was a URI method. And so this is part of it. Everything past this API is what we need to fill out in this part right here, URI path. Okay. The other thing we need is the REST method. We saw that from the API Explorer. This is a post method, post. So if we go back into here, we can now fill this out as post. Query data we don't need, but we need something in the request body. Remember, that was a JSON object that was created when we queried all those fields right here. So that was the JSON object that goes in the request body. We'll get to that in a minute, because that's actually going to have to be something that's created in our transformation and passed into here. So we're going to do that in a minute. And then finally, additional headers. We need to populate that because we are using JSON to pass and receive information through the API calls. So we want to fill that out here. And that was also defined here, the request and the response under the request headers. So that's where we can get that information. But that's pretty typical because we're using JSON for everything here. So if I save that, that gets us very close to where we need to be. So let's save that here. Now let's go back into our JST designer and let's finish this out. So remember, we made this human readable, but ultimately we don't need these things, because we need to pass it into a format that's acceptable for the ServiceNow entry. So what we want to do is we want to create that JSON object. I think I created a lot of extra stuff here. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to take that data along with some other data and turn it into a JSON object that we can pass to the ServiceNow API call that is appropriate and correct, so that it can update that database table, that inventory table. So one of the ways, and I think maybe one of the easier ways, is using something called a template literal. And this has a lot of different functions. But in this case, we're going to use it to define a JSON object. So let me paste something in here and I'll walk you through it. Okay, so as you can see, this is a JSON object. You got the curly brackets, you've got the keys and the values here. You see this $sign, and then in curly brackets here, IP address, version, location. I'm defining it within this template. I'm defining variables that need to be filled out by something outside of the template. And this is the format of the variables that we saw in the inventory columns, right, from ServiceNow. So these have to be the same names as ServiceNow is expecting. And so we got that. You can get that again from the REST API call. It tells us name, IP address. So these variables have to match inside of here. But also we want to take these variables from these calls that we formatted in the right way and pass them into this template literal. And then you're also going to see a couple of the other fields that I filled out as part of this database record. The description, the short description, a little cheeky, imported by Itential automation, a little cheeky message there. The default device type is going to be a router. So all of the devices that I'm going to group together to do this, to use in this automation ultimately, are going to be the same. They're all going to be routers. And in this case, they're all going to be Cisco devices with the manufacturer of Cisco. So I can go ahead and populate those statically. The company that owns them is Itential. And I know that they all can route, they can all partition VLANs, and they all can all switch. Those are all columns inside the inventory. So I can go ahead and populate all of these things that are similar for all these devices and just pull in the information that's dynamic for each one of them. And so that's what I'm doing here. So pay attention to these 4 variables, because when I click update, our template literal changes and it includes these variables now. Because what it's saying is you've defined variables. Where do those variables live? Where are you gonna map those variables from? So if we can go back here, and this is where we can take our existing work. Let me minimize that. So this is get version. It maps to this query. So this get version can go to here and map to the version that we've defined. This is the IP address, correct? IP address maps to here. It's going through these transformation methods. And now I can map this to IP address. And then lastly, get location. That's the SNMP location. I can map that to the location field. And then router name is not defined here. We're going to statically assign this for now. So I'm going to use core since that's what we've been testing. And now we need to output it into something. And honestly, we're just going to output this as a string. And I'm going to call this update ServiceNow as the variable, because we're going to pass it into the API, but it's going to be in the format of a JSON object. So this now is going to put it in the format that API call to ServiceNow needs to update the table. So if I run this here to test it, it's going to give me back that object that we defined as in the template literal, that template. Now it's all on one line. We'll see it a little better in a minute. Okay, so that's good. So now we can go back to our workflow, and now we can fill out this final piece. So I'm going to reload this because this transformation, because we changed the output. And now, since that's going to correctly create the JSON object that gets passed to here, all we need is, remember the request body. That's a JSON object. We learned that from the Explorer here, request body, and it creates a JSON object with all those fields. That's what we need to pass into here. So the reference task, instead of being static like the rest of them, is now dynamic, created by the ServiceNow W4 concept transformation. And that's the same name we just defined, update ServiceNow. Take a look at that. Update ServiceNow. So there we go. So now if we save this, we can save this. Oh, I need to pop something right onto here. I need to click that. Okay, now we'll save it again. Gave me a warning, said you really need to click that. Now if I start this, now let's view the job. Now it's running. So the first step, that our phase 1 that we earlier defined, let's get some information from all these routers. Once that finishes, our transformation is going to take the data from each one of these sources as incoming. It's going to transform it, turn it into something that ServiceNow can use, and it's already completed the call. So let's take a look. So here's the incoming information we sent to ServiceNow. So that's that request body. So that's that JSON that we formatted, that JSON object we formatted in our transformation. And it should have created a brand new entry into our table here. If we reload this, there it is, core ATL 0. So core ATL 0, we queried that in real time. Let's take a look at the field. So in that JSON object that we used in our transformation, it set the fields up for setting the manufacturer to Cisco, setting the firmware manufacturer to Cisco. It pulled the IP address from the CLI command. We transformed the data to only the things we needed, and we parsed out the IP address, and now we filled that field out here. We've set the device type to router because we know these are all routers. And then here's our firmware version, right? So we know this is the update firmware version 5.5.3. And if I go to other details, it's parsed out the SNMP location and correctly filled that out. So we have just tested this. Oh, and it's also marked these checkboxes because we know that all of these devices can do these things. So now it's filled out all of that dynamically through an automation for one device. So that's a successful test. Now, if we can do it for one device, how do we expand this to do it for multiple devices? Because ultimately, we want to be able to parse through a lot of devices instead of doing this manually by hand. Well, we've done all of the work right here for the main part of it. So let me show you kind of a more completed way to do it with the group. So notice here, this is our three main phases, right? Execute some commands, get that. We're going to transform it in a JSON object or a JSON transformation, and then we're going to write it to the ServiceNow. So all of that is exactly what we've built. So what I've added onto here are some other elements of what you can do in a workflow. So in this case, I'm getting a list of devices by a group. So where does that come from? If I go back to Configuration Manager, this is another part of our application. I showed you where we have an inventory of everything that's been onboarded, every network device that's been onboarded into the system. These are CLI devices for the most part. I can create a group. So I've created a group here, and I've called it Snow Routers, ServiceNow Routers. And I've added to the group Core ATL 1, 2, and 3. So 3 devices are here. I could add more, can add a lot. But we started testing with 1. Now I'm going to create a group, and I want to iterate through this group one at a time and execute all of those commands that we had done in the automation. So that's what this does. It's going to get the group, and that's going to return, in this case, those 3 elements. I'm going to query. Remember our query. We're going to get the devices, so the individual device in that group, and then we have a for loop. So this is going to loop, and it's going to get that's the first device going through the loop one time, right? And it's going to get the second device the next time, and the third device, until it's exhausted all of the elements in the array, and then it's going to go to end. And so for the first device, then it's going to kick off all of this. And now, since that device name is a variable, the one thing that I have done here is, instead of the router name, remember we configured this as a static device. That router name is actually going to come from the for loop here. You can see that we're referencing it here. It's the current item in the array list. So this is going to change dynamically as it goes through that list of devices. So this is now how we can scale this to multiple devices in a group and let it run. So we can start this now and let this go, and it should iterate through each one of those devices in that device group and run these commands and now populate a new field in that ServiceNow inventory. And we'll be able to also see every iteration through here. So it just doesn't show you the last iteration. You can actually go back and see in every one of these, in the job view, in every one of these tasks, what iteration is running through. So for instance, if I click through here, here's iteration 1. We can take a look at the incoming variable. It started with Core ATL 1, and then it shows us our output information. So this is the CLI command, right? So this is running version 16.10 on that version of the router. But then I can also go back to the second iteration here. So the first iteration used host Core ATL 1, the second iteration used Core ATL 2, and the third one will be Core ATL 3, because it's iterating through all of that. And now we go back and everything is complete. So the job finished. And so if we now go back into ServiceNow and I refresh, here's our inventory for our routers. And now it's populated all of those. So we started with our test, which statically did Core ATL 1, but now we've iterated through a group. And now I can start to add and remove devices from that group inside Itential, run that automation again, and now I can batch create all of these entries into the inventory. And now we don't have to run things manually, right? Now we've automated that whole procedure to populate the ServiceNow database for these IP routers with information that is relevant for each device and unique to each device, right? The IP address, location, things like that. So that's how we've done that. So that's really the meat of this. But then now that we have this as an inventory source of truth, how do we now start to use that in our network automations if we need to reference it? So really, when we want to read that device and so we're going to use the generic adapter request. And again, this is where we can draw from our ServiceNow REST API Explorer. So instead of creating a record, I can retrieve records from a table. And this allows us to retrieve records from a table to get all the records or even a specific record. And so using this as an example, this is where you can find all of the values you need for a specific generic API call like this. And so if I go back to the automation itself for reading, what I want to show you is I have 2 calls. One is to query all IP routers. So this is going to return everything inside of that table. So again, this is our URI path, which we can find through the REST API Explorer. The REST method is not post, it's get, again, from the REST API Explorer. Um, Once you go through the API Explorer, you'll find that in this case, we need to populate query data. Earlier for the post, we needed to populate request data. In this case, we're going to populate query data. We're going to say, hey, give me a limit of 10. Um, and we're going to ask for these particular fields. Remember, every column in that inventory gets returned back. So we want to really filter that back out to only the things we're really interested in. And in this case, we only want the fields for name, IP address, SNMP location, and something called sysid, which is an internal unique ID for every element or inside that table. And again, we're going to set the headers to accept and to use JSON objects. And that's really it. And so that's how you do all the query for all the routers or a specific number of routers. To do a specific router, so let's say you have the name and you want to query the specific router, it's essentially the same thing, except I'm adding one more element into the query data. I'm adding the syscommand query. So now I'm asking for a specific element in the table. In this case, it's got to meet the criteria of the name equals core ATL0. So instead of giving me a bunch of different devices, it's going to give me a very specific device. And so this is one way to do it too. And everything else is pretty much the same here. But all of that information can be determined through the REST API Explorer is an easy way to do it, or reading through the documentation, or even our pre-built library for our customers to see these as examples. So to finally, to finish the webinar out, let's just run this and we can see the output of it. Okay, so it's completed. Go to visualize. So here's the query all IP routers. So now we queried the table we just populated. And now the response that we get back is an array. So it's got multiple elements in the array for results. But here we go. Here's IP router 3, which was one of the demo routers that was already populated, IP router 1 and its IP address. Here's core ATL2, core ATL0, test router 1, which we created through the API Explorer. And it's giving us the list of all of them that are in there. And then if we really wanted to query 1, that's our second call here. And by adding that sysparam, again, we can show you here, by adding this sysparam and specifying name equals core ATL0. And this could be any field, right? You could look by IP address and that net mask in there and try to match on that. But in this case, if we know the name of the device, then I can query it and get the information that I needed to. And this is the information that we populated, right? This is the SNMP, the name and the IP address that we populated earlier. Okay, so with that, we're going to end the demo. I want to thank you very much. So what we did was we showed how to build a workflow and automation that allows you to read something from the network, transform the data, and now write it directly into a ServiceNow inventory table so that you can use it as a source of truth. We were able to expand that to not just do a single device that you would manually have to enter that host name. Instead, we can dynamically generate a group of host names from our inventory and iterate through a for each loop through each one of those, and now create run the automation that now is relevant for a lot of them. So you can batch this up and get through that entire inventory during your maintenance window or whatever, right? And then ultimately, once that's populated, how do I read that and turn that back into something that I could use as a source of truth for my inventory? So hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that gives you a really advanced use case. And we think, having heard from our customers, these are the kinds of things that they're wrestling with. We have to do this manually. We don't have the time to do it. Is there a way to automate this? Because it's not normally something where we would just create tickets and things like that in order to use ServiceNow. This is becoming more and more of a big use case because as inventory control is being done more and more through ServiceNow, this is a way that the network team and the DevOps team and the ServiceNow administrators can work together to help use ServiceNow as the central point of inventory, if that's the go-ahead strategy for your organization. So with that, thank you very much. We appreciate the time. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Bye-bye.